Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us today. It is June 1st, 2023. We have a really good schedule today. We're going to have presentations on the Countywide Watershed Management Plan, projects that enhance stream flow, and an update on the impact of the most recent winter storms in Ventura County. And then I will be reviewing a stakeholder survey result, which should be pretty informative, and I would love to get people's impact on it before I finalize a work plan for approval from the leadership committee for the Watershed Council. So with that, I just want to open it up. Does anyone want to make any comments or ask any questions before we get started with the first presentations? This is kind of your guys' time to bring up anything that you would like to see addressed later in another meeting or today.
Well, Heidi, a bit of news. We closed on 9.55 acres on San Antonio Creek yesterday, right in the floodway of the creek, right where, essentially where the sewer break was during the flooding. So OVLC is now a proud owner of another chip of land right in San Antonio Creek. Bit of news.
Oh, awesome. Very cool. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other updates? It's hard to top that, huh? Okay, cool. So, David, are you ready to lead your introduction for your section?
I sure am, and thank you very much, Heidi. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing us to present to the council today on the development of the Countywide Watershed Management Program. The efforts being undertaken by the Ventura Countywide Stormwater Quality Management Program, which includes the County of Ventura, Ventura County Watershed Protection District, who I work for, and the 10 incorporated cities within Ventura County. We're collectively known as the Stormwater Permittees. The 2021 Regional MS4 permit, or Stormwater permit, allows for alternative compliance pathway through the development of a watershed management program, or WIMP, to identify water quality priorities and to let's see here. About that. And we have hired Craftwater Engineering back in April of 2022 to help develop the Countywide Watershed Management Program. And that covers Malibu Creek, Cayugas Creek, Santa Clara River, the coastal watersheds, and the Ventura River Watershed, which we'll be focusing on today. And it is due to the regional board by September 11th, 2023. Basically the WIMP kind of allows for the identification of the water quality issues that are high priorities. And then comes up with a combination of pollutant control measures to kind of meet those water quality objectives. So this has been an ongoing effort. Every city, the county, and Watershed Protection District have been deeply involved, and we've got an excellent consulting crew here from Craftwater Engineering. And joining us today is Brad Wardinsky and Brianna Datai, who will be giving the bulk of the presentation. And they'll be kind of going over the overview of the development of the WIMP so far, the WIMP framework, how the countywide program is pursuing compliance with the water quality requirements in the watershed, and an overview of the program enhancements and structural projects for potential implementation. So with that, I will throw it right over to Brad and Brianna for the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Dave. Brianna, if you want to flip down to the slide with the Watershed Management Program overview. Dave provided a great summary of kind of why we're here and why we're doing this, but what we really want to try to kind of inform folks today is kind of what makes up this Watershed Management Program that we're developing, and what are some of the initial kind of indications or the direction that it's pointing the group. So like what was mentioned, since the Ventura County permittees are now folded into this regional permit, that permit has this framework in place where they can use this program as a pathway to basically get relief from compliance actions while everyone is working towards improving water quality. And so as we're putting this overall plan together, it's really an initial plan to point all the permittees in the right direction. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how there's also adaptive management built in so that as we learn more about how these actions are actually improving water quality, we can then use that to improve things going forward. So on the screen here, we're showing the basic components, and we're going to walk through a lot of this today to give an overview of where we're at. So the first being the water quality characterization, basically what pollutants are we trying to manage and reduce from coming out of the end of each city or agency's pipes. What types of control measures are currently being implemented by the groups, and then what more could potentially be done to improve water quality. And that's both non-structural controls, things like street sweeping, source control activities that the group is already doing to reduce pollutants before they can even get into the storm drain system, as well as structural control measures, which would be, in essence, digging holes and capturing stormwater and doing something meaningful with it, whether that's putting it in the ground or treating it, using nature-based solutions to improve water quality, as well as provide as many other multiple benefits as possible. And then what we do is once we understand the water quality and what can be done, we perform what's called a reasonable assurance analysis, or an RAA. We're getting all the acronyms out of the way here on the first slide. And that's basically a modeling exercise. So we simulate the watersheds and figure out how that combination of actions and pollutant priorities can be combined to address these issues. And then we put it all together into an initial schedule and cost estimates. So we'll walk through each of these today. On the next slide, you'll see that because we've been kind of keeping an eye on what the LA County permittees have been doing under the stormwater permit, we already came into this with a lot of lessons learned. And one of those things that we really wanted to focus on was trying to make this as achievable as possible. There was a very high price tag for the watershed management programs in LA County. And so we were looking at what they did, and we wanted to make sure that we were right-sizing this program to the unique conditions in Ventura County. And so that means taking a very thoughtful look at the regulations and making sure that we're addressing them in a meaningful but cost-effective way, as well as leveraging those non-structural activities that the group has already invested in, like I mentioned earlier. In addition to that, we know that there are likely to be some projects, some structural project requirements in a lot of areas, including in the Ventura River Watershed. And so we also wanted to make sure that these provide enough guidance and certainty to the permittees that they know specifically what projects are available for them to do, instead of saying, go capture X acre feet of water, good luck trying to figure out how to do that. We wanted to make sure that there's actually a list of projects that the agencies have at their fingertips so that they understand what's possible out there. The next part of the philosophy that we kind of embodied as we were putting this overall program together is, even though we're being very specific about what's possible on the project and the program side, making sure that we have flexibility as well to track success and account for pollutant reduction. And so doing that through a pretty simple accounting process and setting up the targets in this program around pollutant capture. And then that leads to the last part of the overall philosophy of adaptive management. So I had mentioned this earlier, we're making sure that we're kind of leaving these open kind of portals in the plan so that as we learn more about what kind of projects make the most sense and work best in these watersheds from a feasibility perspective, as we look at the monitoring data over time and see which programs are providing the best benefits and highest performance, we can then update the program over time. And then through that pollutant accounting and tracking, we can really make sure that we're allowing all the permittees to take credit for all the great work that they're doing. So that's kind of the overview and the guiding principles of how we're putting all of this together. And then next, Brianna is going to start to dive into some of the details about that first aspect of the water quality characterization and what we're actually trying to manage.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So really, the first piece of this, as Brad was saying, is to identify what are the current conditions within the watershed and what are the key pollutants or the pollutants of concern that we want to focus on within this watershed management program. And so what we have done, it does really kind of clearly lay out within the MS4 permit how you have to lay out those priorities in terms of the different categories that are established. So really the top priority are for water bodies and associated pollutants that have an established total maximum daily load, which is where the regulators have previously identified that current pollutant levels need to be reduced in order to meet the protection of the beneficial uses of that water body, and that those levels specifically must be reduced within a certain time frame. So those have specific deadlines that have to be met. The second tier priority are for pollutants in water bodies that the regulators have identified are causing an impairment to the existing beneficial uses, but have not yet adopted a total maximum daily load with a final deadline to achieve the specified water quality target. And then our last tier in terms of the water quality priorities are where we've looked through the local monitoring data within the watershed and have seen exceedances of the set water quality objectives within the last 5 years, but for which there's not yet been established an impairment listing or an established total maximum daily load. So these are the 3 different types of pollutants that we're evaluating within the watershed to see what needs to be done to make sure that the appropriate objectives are being met. I'll also just say the map that's shown on the right here, there really is a comprehensive data set within this region of water quality data. We've used this to actually analyze and support establishing these water quality priorities within the watershed. And also this helps us to inform the potential types of sources where there is elevated pollutants and what is most likely being contributed from the MS4, which is specifically the focus of this program that's being developed. So as we dive in specifically to Ventura River, there are 2 established total maximum daily loads, one for algae and the associated nutrients, and then the other for trash. Now, trash is not directly covered within the watershed management programs as its compliance is based on addressing the statewide trash amendment. So we're really focused on the other pollutants. So as we look through what was established within Ventura River, again, that category 1 or the top priority is based on the nutrients associated with the algae total maximum daily load. And then water bodies within this watershed were also listed as impaired by indicator bacteria, where monitoring data continues to be above the established water quality objectives that are protective of beneficial uses. And then lastly, based on our review of data in the watershed, most pollutants were actually consistently below established water quality objectives, which did demonstrate overall pretty good water quality conditions. The only one that was identified outside of the nutrients and bacteria was the chlorpyrifos, which is an organic, and there was only a limited amount of exceedances observed, but it was within the last 5 years, so we include this in terms of the pollutants identified within the watershed to be addressed by the watershed management program. And so again, as we're diving into each of these steps of the watershed management program development, these are the specific pollutants that we are focused on to evaluate, determine how much needs to be done to reduce them, and the potential actions that can reduce the levels for a healthy water body. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Brad, and he's going to walk through our overall reasonable assurance analysis approach.
Yeah, and I guess I'll briefly add and clarify that those are definitely the priorities of the plan from a municipal perspective. There may be pollutant sources and priorities coming from sources outside of the municipal storm drain system. But again, this program is really focused on what's coming out of the developed areas and out of the end of the storm drain pipes. And so I think that kind of brings us to some of the key pillars of how we're setting up this reasonable assurance analysis, which is again kind of the modeling exercise that we do to help the permittees plan for how they can improve water quality. What we really want to do is make sure that we're using the local data that we have from those storm drain outfalls, all that great data that Brianna showed on the map and that a lot of you are involved with collecting over the last many, many years, and then making sure that we're applying an appropriate understanding of how the regulations and how the permit is set up to actually perform this analysis in a meaningful way. And then making sure that we're setting up those targets so that we really are trying to isolate what's coming out of the MS4 system and being very specific about that while providing flexibility to operate at more of a watershed scale. So that's one of the benefits of these watershed management programs is the agencies can work collectively at more of a watershed scale in order to manage those loads that are collectively coming off of the different jurisdictions. So in the next couple slides, we'll really focus on the first two of these pillars, and then the second two is how we actually manage those MS4 specific requirements. So leveraging the minimum control measures, which is another name for those non-structural programs, as well as putting together potential project pathways, structural project-based pathways to achieve clean water. And so that'll come later in a couple slides. We'll talk about how the draft RAA is kind of revealing some of those implementation strategies. So the first step here again is to really make sure that we're setting up a modeling system that we can trust and rely on based on all that monitoring data. And the guidelines that are associated with the municipal stormwater permit lay out very specific requirements for how you need to dial in these watershed models and meet certain calibration criteria, some of which are shown on the screen, just for example, to make sure that we can have confidence that this model is simulating reality as accurately as we can with a computer model. And so when we calibrated this model, we really set it up for these major assessment areas or watershed boundaries throughout Ventura County, and we focused on the water quality and the flow data that was coming out of the MS4 outfalls, and then we used the receiving water monitoring stations as additional context to make sure that we have confidence that this model is set up to give us a good basis for making decisions going forward. Then the next step that Brianna is going to talk about is how we then kind of cookie cutter in the jurisdictional boundaries to make sure that we're specifically looking at those.
Yeah, so as Brad was saying, really the assessment areas are that foundation for how we're evaluating the baseline conditions and the required reductions of the pollutants within the watershed. The focus is on where the MS4, again, is actually contributing to the water bodies, as you can kind of see outlined in the map here. And that's really critical that we're evaluating, how much runoff and associated pollutants are actually coming off of the jurisdictional land and potentially through the MS4 system into the water bodies to determine what the MS4s can actually reduce. So as we were laying out these assessment areas, it is important to get the right balance in terms of the scale for the size of these. You want something large enough that you can focus on the most effective control measures in more feasible areas that are going to do the most in terms of actually improving the receiving water conditions. But you also need to make sure that they're fine enough that we can represent what needs to be protected within each of the water bodies distinctly and help in terms of tracking moving forward for how much the MS4s have implemented. So across countywide, there are 14 total assessment areas that are covered within these watershed management programs. And Ventura River specifically, there is divided into 2 assessment areas. And that was really delineated based on the natural and system drainages, as well as where we do have monitoring data, as I mentioned, to help with tracking moving forward of progress and what we're trying to improve. In addition, these specific jurisdictions participating within the watershed management program are clearly laid out on the map within the assessment areas. And while the approach is to target those pollutant load reductions at an assessment area scale so that the group is working together, the model also allows us to establish these jurisdiction-specific targets based on the proportional responsibilities. So it's still clear in terms of the responsibilities for each of the agencies moving forward.
So that covers kind of those first 2 pillars of using good science to make sure we have a good model, setting up our targets, and then once we know what load of nutrients, pesticides, and bacteria we need to reduce in the Ventura River watershed, then we can start stacking up different potential pathways in order to meet those load reductions. And so on the next slide, it shows our kind of overarching strategy. And again, this goes back to our original philosophy of trying to make sure we're leveraging activities that are already ongoing in the watershed to the extent plan before we start prescribing new structural projects. And so the approach is to first take a look at what redevelopment is occurring over time. So as infill redevelopment occurs, then there's low impact development that is required to be installed in response to that. So post-construction projects that capture stormwater whenever, let's say, a new fast food restaurant is installed within a parking lot of a grocery store, for example, or some of the more common commercial redevelopment type activities. And so what we did is we looked at general plans throughout the county, and we pulled out what are those redevelopment rates for residential, commercial, and industrial land use. And then we extrapolated out into the future. What does that mean in terms of how much impervious area will effectively be taken offline through these post-construction projects going forward? So those are activities that are already going to be happening. We want to make sure that the permittees are taking credit for the pollutant reduction of those. Next, we say, okay, the group is doing things like street sweeping. There's a lot of source control activities out there. Some of them we're doing catch basin cleaning, and there's an opportunity to potentially enhance catch basin cleaning activities. And so we took a look at this full breadth of different types of non-structural activity enhancements that could further reduce the deposition of pollutants on the surface or reduce their transport into storm drains. So eliminating them before they even get into the system. And what we landed on with most of the permittees is enhancing street sweeping coverage through increasing the frequency could be a very cost-effective way to gobble up a lot of those pollutants off of the paved surfaces and reduce the potential of them actually getting downstream. And so that's kind of the next tier of activities that we looked at. And then if we still needed some additional treatment to reduce the load to get to our targets, then we took a look at where can we potentially find those opportunities to capture stormwater throughout the landscape. So that's the general approach. And then on the next couple of slides, we'll dive into a little bit more details on each of those slices and then show how it actually ends up kind of stacking up for the different pollutants of concern in the Ventura River watershed.
So specifically, as Brad mentioned, for the enhancements to the minimum control measures, we did evaluate a suite, but really honed in on street sweeping. And it really is an effective control measure for us in terms of being able to remove the pollutants on the roadways before they're able to get washed off into the MS4 system and eventually into downstream receiving waters. So again, just how we're actually representing it within the modeling is as the pollutants are building up on the roadway surface, when the runoff comes through, that is then washed off downstream. But if a street sweeper has come by before that runoff occurs, then those pollutants have been removed from the system. And the key factors really in terms of the effectiveness of street sweeping is in terms of the frequency of sweeping, how much area you're actually covering. In other words, how many rows are you actually getting to? Also, the different types of sweepers have different effectiveness. And another component is also how close is a sweeper able to actually access the curb where most of the pollutants typically reside on the road surface. So for example, that can be impacted if there's more parked cars along the side of a road. They're maybe not able to access that curb where there might be more pollutants present. So we looked across these multiple elements in terms of the enhancements. And in discussions with the agencies, really found that an increase in frequency is the most feasible to implement and provides a really beneficial pollutant load reduction. If we're getting out there more, we're removing those pollutants before they can actually be washed off, and take credit for that in terms of that enhancement to move forward within the larger watershed management program.
And then in areas where that additional enhancement to the non-structural programs doesn't quite get us to where we need to be, again, that's where we start looking for opportunities to capture stormwater and treat it to remove those contaminants. And so what we did is we went through an exercise countywide. We worked with all of the agencies in Ventura River Watershed as well as in the other 4 watersheds that are being evaluated to look at public parcel opportunities that are within control of the permittees, figure out where do we have a lot of potentially polluted runoff, where do we have an opportunity to, again, kind of dig a big hole to put that runoff in, and then how do we get water from that drainage system to that big hole. And so that was a pretty robust exercise using maps and geographic information systems to figure out where are all those potential points throughout the landscape. Our engineers then take a look at each one to do a desktop feasibility review, and then we reviewed each of those points, which I think we started with, over 1,000 potential projects, and whittled them down to a couple hundred potential opportunities that the group has available to them in their toolkit going forward to address these water quality issues. And then we also took a look at the existing projects, the existing best management practices that are already out there throughout the landscape to make sure that we weren't recommending any redundant projects. So a lot of these types of projects that we were looking for could potentially take the shape of detention or filtration type basins on the surface of the land, or infiltration galleries or vaults that are installed below things like sports fields. So you're still maintaining the current use of those public spaces, but also getting the additional benefit of stormwater capture and treatment to provide those watershed scale benefits. So once we went through those exercises, then it all comes together. And right now we are still in the process of developing this draft watershed management program. Nothing is finalized, and that's why we are having this meeting right now with you all to get any additional input on types of strategies. But what the initial reasonable assurance analysis is showing is that to manage those nutrients in this particular watershed, there are likely going to need to be a couple of new structural projects built in order to kind of manage that additional load that needs to be managed beyond just increasing street sweeping and relying on the ongoing redevelopment projects. And so the group now has this kind of robust hopper of potential projects that they can look at going into the future and start to plan for which of those might have the best opportunities for funding, which ones might have the best local support, which ones might have the best potential for constructibility. When it comes to bacteria, that is a very interesting pollutant to deal with because of the nature of how it's distributed throughout the landscape. And so there's actually a completely different approach that's being taken to manage pathogen risks that Brianna's going to go over on the following slide. But it's very targeted, and it's a lot more cost effective than some of the permittees pursued in LA County. And so we'll talk about that again here in just a second. And then for organics, we found that ongoing redevelopment and the projects that are going to go in post-construction can be expected to manage that load. And so really in this given watershed, what we would call our limiting pollutant, or the one that's really driving implementation activities, would be nutrients. And so the group has a number of these different potential projects available to them in order to try to manage that load going forward.
All right, so as Brad was just saying, bacteria really is unique in and of itself. So it is addressed separately within the watershed management program, as its fate and transport and the different sources is really distinct compared to other pollutants. So the way that this is approached within the reasonable assurance analysis is that the baseline loading and the required load reductions for bacteria are based on a statistical analysis that was conducted using observed flows and the fecal indicator bacteria concentrations. And then the implementation approach is also incorporating a look at targeting where the high-risk sources are likely present first. So the issue with high levels of bacteria is really a potential impact to human health for people potentially getting sick when they recreate within the water bodies. But over the last few years, the latest science and the approaches does clearly identify that it's really the presence of pathogens that can cause those potential illnesses. And human sources of bacteria do pose the highest risk of having those pathogens. So the fecal indicator bacteria that are typically looked at in terms of bacterial levels are often comprised of many different sources, some of which are less likely to actually have pathogens present. And so while our load reduction target within the reasonable assurance analysis is still based on the fecal indicator bacteria because that is consistent with the current standards and the regulations, we are incorporating an initial assessment on top of this to look at the higher risk areas based on available human marker data or data that we've compiled from the agencies on the potential presence of human waste sources within a catchment area. So this included analysis of data to evaluate the potential vulnerability of a leaky sewer system, for example, high homeless activity, or if there are frequent illicit discharges that are associated with bacteria issues within the watershed. And so then from this information, we're actually recommending a look at these targeted catchment areas for the priority areas to actually address in terms of reducing the bacteria loads to help us to meet those objectives in order to really protect recreational users. So given the complex nature, again, of bacteria, we are leaving in flexibility in terms of the types of control measures that can be implemented. So we just walked through the redevelopment, low impact development assumptions, the enhanced street sweeping, and other structural controls. But when it comes to bacteria, we are trying to emphasize a source control approach where possible to conduct more of the actual human waste source investigations and abatement. But we do acknowledge that if source control is not possible, there are other potential structural control measure opportunities. As we've mentioned, we've identified a number of opportunities throughout the watershed with the initial screening that was conducted that we can utilize in terms of being able to achieve this load reduction that's been identified for bacteria. So just a little further detail in terms of the potential kind of human waste sources that we are looking at when we do this analysis. This shows the layout in terms of the key ones, where again, we're combining the information about, like I said, potential leaky sewers or illicit discharges with information on available human marker data. So for example, that's often HS1E3 that we have measured in some of these watersheds, along with the previous fecal indicator bacteria or E. coli data that has been gathered. And so we evaluate these potential sources that might be present, along with this human marker data to target those high-risk areas. And again, really, abatement of human waste sources has been identified as the most cost-effective approach to actually avoiding illnesses in recreational users of the water bodies. So that's why we're adding in this layer on top of the reasonable assurance analysis. And so ultimately what we do have, though, is these targeted areas, kind of just showing a snapshot across the Ventura River catchment and the associated assessment areas for the targeted catchment. So in some cases, we also have previous data that's been compiled in terms of the human marker data that might have indicated that there was no presence of human sources, in which case we'd actually want to deprioritize those areas when it comes to this approach. So you can see those kind of in the hashing areas based on the previous data. We do this separately for dry weather and wet weather. So you can see under dry weather, we have 2 catchments that are targeted that would need to be addressed to meet that required load reduction. And then in wet weather, there are 7 catchment areas outlined in the green. That would be the top priority to address to actually reduce that amount of bacteria load to meet the reductions that are required for the MS4 areas within the watershed.
So that's kind of the initial direction that the program is taking. But what we do want to point out is that adaptive management component. So again, while this program will provide an initial trajectory to the group in terms of what activities they should consider going forward over the next several years, they're also in coordinating developing a monitoring program that specifically targets the pollutants of concern as well as a number of other constituents. And so as time goes on, we learn more and more about how these activities work and how the water quality is improving. That can then be used to adapt the program over time to even further right-size it to the conditions in the Ventura River watershed. And so in terms of next steps, like I mentioned, we're still finalizing the reasonable assurance analysis and the draft watershed management program. We're putting together those schedules and those cost estimates. And then, like David mentioned at the beginning, the ultimate deadline here is in a couple months, submitting it to the regional board for consideration. And so we really appreciate your time today. And if you have any comments or questions for input, we would be certainly happy to take those now. And I know that one of them that came up in the chat that I think we can respond to was about manure management at equestrian facilities and how that's addressed in the analysis. And so I'll provide kind of a high-level overview, and then Brianna, if you want to add to it. But basically, when we're setting up this watershed model to simulate where those different pollutants are coming from, we're looking at different land uses. And so we have land uses broken out in our model for example, agriculture, residential, commercial, industrial, and each of those kind of contributes pollutants at different rates in the model. And so that's one way that we account for these different potential sources. And then if they're located within those jurisdictional boundaries that Brianna showed on the maps earlier, then that's going to be kind of taken into account when we're putting together the reduction targets, as well as when we're modeling the potential programs and projects that could address those sources of pollution. So it's all kind of linked together within the model that we built. Is there anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was a good overview. I think, as Brad was mentioning, we have used the actual specific land uses that we're representing within the model, and we're using the local data to kind of calibrate those in. So based on the local data, we parameterize how much we're expecting to come off of those typical land uses. So then also, as we're looking within the model, we can clearly see where the highest loading potentially is coming from. And again, as we're looking at these different project opportunities as well, identifying where we can be most effective, where we can capture up the most of those pollutant loads that are causing the exceedances from the MS4 perspective.
So, David, if there's anything else you want to add, anything we missed, feel free, or if there's any questions or comments from the group, we're happy to take those now.
No, yeah, I mean, you guys covered a lot of information in a short time, and so I'm sure there's some questions. So yeah, I'd love to hear if anybody has any questions or wants some more specific information.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. I took away the webinar format, so it's kind of easier for us to just have a conversation. I just have a low-level question I was curious about. With the street sweepers and their effectiveness, does it matter if they're sweeping dry or sweeping wet? I just kind of noticed, like where I live, they've been sweeping dry, and I just noticed it's gotten like really dusty when they do it, but maybe that still works for this watershed management plan. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of like the level of that we're looking at within the watershed management program, we based kind of the effectiveness on the existing operations. And so when you are sweeping wet, you know, there's different literature out there that can be more effective. And the other key thing that we see is also just the timing of the sweeper before a storm coming through is more important in terms of the benefits that from our perspective we're getting in terms of the actual pollutant loads being reduced. But one thing I should clarify is also, you know, the street sweeping is something that's been going on for a long time across the agencies. And so that is within our baseline assumptions or baseline modeling for how much benefits there. So we're looking at specifically how much additional could we get by enhancing what they're currently doing. So it's based on their current programs and then how could they enhance it.
Thank you. And there's one question in the chat asking, is there a review and comment process for this plan from stakeholders?
Yeah, so I can add, so when it is submitted to the regional board, the formal review process is it will be open up for public comment at that time as well. So the full plan will be made public for review. And I believe they normally have, it's either a 60 or 90-day review period for public comment within that period.
And then in addition, we're having a number of these kind of public outreach meetings to get information out there about how the plan is coming together. So any early input is appreciated now. And we have a number of other meetings with other watershed councils, and then a second set of meetings a little bit later on once the draft WIMP is finalized.
And I did want to add on to that. I was just wondering if anyone, you know, can put some thought into it, and I'll put my contact information in the chat, but I was wondering if anyone had suggestions or ideas on who else may be interested in hearing about this project that isn't at this meeting. Primarily, like if a nighttime meeting would be helpful for those that are otherwise preoccupied during the day. So yeah, please let me know. And again, I'll put my contact information there in the chat.
Tom, I think that's you, Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. Did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, it's a more sort of new guy question about the phenology of these algae problems. I get calls and people bring it up all the time that they see all the algae and they immediately assume it's solely a anthropogenic nutrient-based thing. But then if you get way up in the watershed, you still see these huge native algae blooms. So do we have a sense of the sort of natural history of this algae? I'm trying to learn more about it because it does seem dramatic. You know, I live next to the river in the lower part of the watershed, and it's really bloomed up heavily this year with a lot more light hitting the stream bed. But maybe somebody could talk to that and the relative impact of anthropogenic nutrient sources.
Yeah, Brianna, do you want to kind of talk about how the objectives are set, I guess, in the basin plan and how that kind of sets the basis for what we're trying to improve?
Yeah, so particularly here, I mean, with the older algae TMDL, so that total maximum daily load, it is based on what the regional board has identified, how much levels need to be reduced to actually avoid those harmful algal blooms. But it is, I think, in terms of your question more about the anthropogenic versus historic, I think what you can see in this watershed is that there is a lot of historic loading that's happened, so it's already there. When you get those certain conditions, you can have those blooms happening over time. Now, I will say just the focus of this effort is more on the current MS4 outfall outputs to make sure that those are not further exacerbating the issue and reducing the loading from the MS4s based on what the TMDL has identified in terms of what needs to be reduced from those responsible parties.
Yeah, it's a good question though, because nutrient and eutrophication issues are pretty complex. And I know that in other watersheds around California, there's been modeling that has indicated even if you remove all of the anthropogenic sources, you would still likely have a lot of algae in place. And so there are other methods out there on looking at kind of what, like you were getting at, what are the natural conditions and kind of setting that as more of a baseline. But unfortunately, we're kind of tied to that TMDL and the objectives that are embedded within it.
And one more just natural history question, I guess, on algae. Does the Ventura ever suffer from the more toxic cyanobacteria or, toxic algae blooms for dogs particularly? Because I moved here from Oakland, and every summer during the drought, somebody's dog would die when it jumped in some nasty water.
Yeah, I can say from our perspective, we have not seen that, and others in this meeting might actually have more history on that. But based on our analysis, yeah, it is more of just the nuisance algae that we've seen in terms of the reductions that's needed, and that's what we're looking at. But again, others in this meeting might have more historic context there too.
Yeah,
There's another comment in the chat asking if cattle grazing activities along the watershed is a major source of bacteria, and if that was taken into account in this study.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we were talking through the bacteria approach, we are using, again, the data that we have. So it's a little bit different, whereas we were describing earlier, we have the kind of land uses represented and the typical pollutant kind of runoff that happens in those areas. For bacteria, we are more limited and looking really at the observed data where we have high fecal indicator bacteria indicated and the load reductions that would be needed there. So we don't have quite as discrete there as we're saying, like we can't identify it as the cattle grazing as the main issue in terms of the actual concentrations that we're seeing that are elevated. But I will say, as I was mentioning about the approach, is while that might be contributing to the higher levels of fecal indicator bacteria, the top priority for us is, again, more of the human waste sources that we can target because those are the issues that are more likely to make people sick. So hopefully that sort of answers your question. Again, we don't quite have the level of detail to specifically say that activity is the one that's causing exceedances.
Yeah, and I would just add the qualifier poorly managed cattle grazing.
Yeah.
In the Kenyatta Largo watershed, because if you manage it more, if it was managed better, there would be much less loading.
Does anyone else have any questions? I see some people are getting their comments addressed in the chat. Does anyone have anything outstanding that they want to raise? Let me know. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you. And David, if you are looking to get more feedback on this, like from the general public, that's something we can talk about later. Our mailing list does go out to about 500 people. So obviously like the organizations come to these like during business hour meetings, but maybe we can try and do like some outreach for like an evening type presentation for this.
That would be great. Yeah. Sounds like a robust email list too. So that's what we're looking for. I'll touch base with you just a bit later, and just wanted to thank both Brad and Brianna. Thank you very much, and everyone here for your great questions and the expertise from the group in answering some of those questions too. So really appreciate it. And I put my contact information if you have any other questions related to this effort. Feel free to give me a call or send an email.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom,
Thanks, everyone.
are you feeling ready to go?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. I'm gonna do the share screen thing,
Okay.
and hopefully this is gonna work. Can you see that?
Yes.
Well, just first and foremost, just thank you and the Ventura River Watershed Council for having me today. It's a real treat to be a presenter, and some of you may know me through my work with the Ventura County Resource Conservation District on the Ventura River In-Stream Flow project. Today's presentation is going to be more of a introduction to other projects that enhance stream flow across the state of California. Not a whole lot of emphasis on the Ventura itself, but the goal would be to share a range of project types for everybody to better recognize similarities, points of comparison, points of contrast. These aren't going to be shared in a way to say, oh, these are all of the issues that are affecting the Ventura. Of course, as I start my PowerPoint, I'm still trying to figure out how to get it to move. I've shared my screen, but now I have to go back over to, sorry about that. All right, there we go. So yeah, at the very least, I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. I've got a lot of slides. If anybody wants to see any of these slides in more detail, I'm happy to follow up and share them. But the idea is just to kind of, hopefully people can quickly recognize who they are or where they might fit in the audience. Landowners, water attorneys, people working with municipalities or agriculture agencies. I know there are a lot of conservation professionals here. Of course, when we talk about voluntary water projects that enhance stream flow, there's always a concerned citizen or two in the audience. So I want to be responsive and be able to take some questions as they might arise. But I also want to just kind of move through this in a way that this gives people, again, a menu of things that are going on to think of. Towards the end of my presentation, I'll invite everybody, if you want to send me your email and your address. I'm the co-author of the California Water Education Foundation's Layperson's Guide to Water Rights Law. Much more information about water rights than I'm going to be covering here today. But if anyone wants to do a little bit more homework, I'm happy to provide a complimentary copy. As we all know, water, there's a lot of great stuff to talk about. Anyone who knows me personally knows that it doesn't take much to get me going. The hardest thing is to stay focused on the individual topic, but with water in California, wet year, dry year. There's just a lot of different angles. So one of the things I particularly enjoy about water rights, water law, is just the different, the multiple facets of point of entry people have as they bring their own expertise and experience to discuss, how are we trying to work together on a problem and how do we solve it? This is a simple Venn diagram. I'm often a landowner representative working with public interest organizations who are receiving money from the Wildlife Conservation Board. And it's that sweet spot in the middle where everybody can find commonality to enhance stream flow. Here on the South Coast, we're looking at steelhead. In other parts of the state, we're looking at salmon. The idea of doing any of this stream flow enhancement, as many of you already know, it's a Sisyphean work. Some people are pushing in one way, other people are pushing in the other way. How to kind of find that sweet spot, it's not for the faint of heart. But the good news is there are many organizations across the state, some of them here in the Ventura, agencies as well, who are sifting through the complexity of regulatory pressure points and really breathing life into a whole new category of projects that enhance stream flow that were largely created in 2014 when the state passed the Prop 1 water bond, providing $200 million to the Wildlife Conservation Board and other pockets of money to entities like the Department of Fish and Wildlife. But with that, you can imagine there's just a whole range of experts and consultants and people who, as an attorney, I work with all the time. We're looking at appraisers, hydrologists, ranch managers, all the types of information that comes together to ideally inform not just landowners, but agencies. And ultimately, we're trying to find increments of wet water that enhance stream flow above baseline conditions. I threw this slide in just to kind of give us all a quick point of comparison that, again, these are snowpack measurements in the Sierras. So I don't want to say that the South Coast has had the same exact 237%, but we all saw a lot of water this year, and it ranks as one of the top 1 or 2 years of this type that we've seen in the last 75 years. So when we talk about projects that enhance stream flow, we're really ricocheting between these extremes of there's a lot of water and then there's not as much water. We're seeing these intense heat events, prolonged multi-year droughts. And just to get a quick glimpse of this slide, you can see that the depth of the pain is getting more intense. Then it's punctuated by these rain events that we're literally ricocheting. And I think one of the promises of these stream flow enhancement type projects is really looking at how do we work within the existing water rights system to affect these voluntary transactions and stream flow transfers. As a practitioner, it's really important to reemphasize that I'm not a regulatory type guy. I don't seek to compel landowners to curtail, but I do recognize that there's always a tension between water use for ag and municipality and other out-of-stream consumptive uses with those in-stream flow type non-consumptive uses. So much of the way these projects take shape around the state fall into the category of what can you do with existing rights? Can you create new rights? Or are there things that you can do that don't even fall within the rubric of a water right? And starting up on the North Coast here, I'm going to take you up to the state of Jefferson and over to the Scott River, where there's a project to enhance stream flow. Again, just more regionally, I think many of you have heard about the Klamath Dam removal. That's not within the scope of this conversation, but just to the east of the Scott River is also the Shasta River, both coho-bearing streams and streams that have a fair amount of agricultural intensity. And some of the most promising work going on in the state is how to reconcile the real property interests of individuals who use and consume water with programs of a voluntary nature to incentivize them to forbear and use less. Here in the Scott River, I highlight the local groundwater basin. Actually, of particular interest, I don't know if people can see Etna Creek and French Creek. We're about to go onto a property that's right below the confluence of the French Creek and the main stem Scott. And without getting into who's the landowner, what's it all about, they've got a bunch of acreage, they use a bunch of water. Our project is helping them figure out how can they use less so they can leave more water in stream. The challenge with that, of course, is that with any water transfer, you're left with the question of, well, how far downstream do you want to transfer it? All water transfers are subject to the so-called no injury rule, which means you can't transfer more than your amount that you reduce from consumptive use. And you have to go through a vigorous protest process where you don't get to just say, I'm going to do it. People get to contest it if they don't agree with your conclusion. Here, the Scott River, a similarity with some portions of the Ventura is it's very alluvial, very strong linkages between groundwater and surface water. Of course, this may seem familiar to people, gaining reaches, losing reaches. Basically, there's a level of communication that goes on between what you see in the creek and what goes on underground. The next 3 slides might be the most memorable things you get from this presentation. You can just see the flow of groundwater undisturbed as it goes into a stream. One puts a well in and the quantity, one goes up the well. Some water that otherwise would have made it to the stream does not get there. And then if you turn up the volume, water from the stream itself gets drawn into the well. These complex hydrogeologic relationships are more than I'm here to cover, but I do kind of zoom back out to show that within the Scott River, the central part of the valley is all adjudicated. There's a decree, and that decree gives everybody a priority and a quantity, and it creates some certainty amongst competing uses of water in times of drought. Again, you can see the groundwater basin, and then that same groundwater basin, here's the combination of groundwater wells and monitoring wells. And without saying, well, where does that end and where does that begin? Just know that that's more expansive than the area of the decree. So as we think about how do we transfer water from a ranch downstream, we're looking at a real mosaic of different agricultural uses. Anyone would, in theory, have the opportunity to protest if they felt that the water that was being quantified was beyond the amount that was being reduced. Shifting along, many of us may be already familiar with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. Also passed in 2014, the same year as the water bond, Prop 1 that is. And one of the main outcomes of that process was the recognition, if you scroll to the end of this list, surface water depletion. The relationships between groundwater pumping and surface water are of extreme concern to the state of California. How to quantify and measure it and do something about it is an ongoing question in many groundwater basins, which are in the process of coming up with groundwater sustainability plans, sometimes referred to as GSPs. I'm not here to get into all of these cases, but I think it's just important to refresh that the State Water Resources Control Board is a regulator, and it's there to make sure that people aren't using water unlawfully. And it also takes on the role of reducing or curtailing the amount that different categories of water users are allowed to use. Appropriative water rights or post-14 and pre-14 rights, and then there are riparian rights. So it's a little bit of it can get hectic, but many of these cases have consistently stood for an enlargement of state water board authority to curtail any water uses, even the most senior rights, if in times of drought and in the benefit of stream flow and the protection of fish. Many of you may, just if not already, I know of the public trust doctrine or the Mono Lake cases. I'm not here to get into all the details of it, other than to say one of the more significant authorities the state of California has is that any water right can be overturned and be non-compensated. It's called a taking. So if one thinks about, well, what's the ultimate limit of a state agency like the State Water Board? It would allow it to take somebody's water right without compensation, which is, personally, I get it. And at the same time, it's very much anathema to the values of small farmers and ranchers who use water lawfully, reasonably, and beneficially. And over time, what we're really seeing is a trend where in times of drought, more reasonable and more beneficial. How do we get there? The Wildlife Conservation Board and projects that enhance stream flow, they use price and dollars to value reduction of water use in order to make sure that ranchers and farmers are not left paying for what are basically societal goals in the reallocation of water. How's everybody doing, Heidi? Do you think we're keeping pace here?
Yeah.
All right. I realize it's a lot of information. Hopefully this stuff is soft on the eye and people aren't glazing over or taking a long break during the presentation. But at the very least, I know that an adjudication looms large in the background here in the Ventura. In the northern parts of the state, there are multiple adjudications that have already occurred, many of them in the mid part of the 20th century, well dating before, call it modern environmentalism, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act type considerations. But we've just been up near the Scott River, we saw the Shasta. Now, if you look where it says Butte near Chico, we're going to zoom down to a recent acquisition by an organization called Friends of Butte Creek of a water right to 5 cubic feet per second, diverted at diversion 54. And just for context, here are the other major points of diversion on the Butte Creek. Some of the most sophisticated water infrastructure in the world. Butte Creek and the nearby Lake Oroville are providing water to tens of thousands of acres, making it some of the most productive and valuable farmland in America because of the reliability of water supplies. Here, that comes in tension with one of the last spring run Chinook populations, and they need water to migrate upstream, and they need water in the upper tributaries to over summer, as it were. And they have to have just cold, deep pools to maintain their vitality. So here, diversion 54 is left in stream for dozens of miles, and really, one might say it's an increment. It's not the full solution. The Department of Fish and Wildlife has not created a firm in-stream flow target. There are no regulatory flow targets, and the Butte Creek water right, diversion 54, and there's about 40 CFS in the stream. That's all the water there is in the stream, and those are both voluntary conservation transactions. Again, zooming out a little bit, down to the Tuolumne River Watershed, another combination of organizations I work with, River Partners based up in Chico and the Tuolumne River Trust. They worked together and they acquired the 2,100 acre Dos Rios Ranch at the confluence of the San Joaquin and the Tuolumne. What makes this really prominent is it was mostly irrigated ag land, using about 7,000 acre feet a year in consumptive use. It's a riparian water right. Now, again, I don't expect everybody to speed read this, but what we're really looking at are, how does a property, in this case, the two conservation partners acquired the property for $30 million with over 7,000 acre feet of consumptive uses. And they're now going to, and again, this is a slide to let everybody know, if you ever forget, California has both appropriative water rights and riparian water rights. Again, ask me, I'll send you a copy of the guide. You can learn more about these rights than you'd ever bargain for. But most other states have only appropriative water rights in the Western states. So that makes, a significant difference in how agencies administer these rights. It's not as simple as just squeezing the landowner in a small little numerical box. Riparian rights themselves have a range of use. They're not just an average 2.7 acre feet per acre. Some years it might use 2.2, other years it might use 3.7. And so it all depends on having the flexibility within the right of that use, that it's, as long as it's used reasonably and beneficially. But again, getting to the water transfer, there are lots of technical issues that are answered by engineers. Here, the water from the property, we're seeking to transfer it to the confluence of the Sacramento River. This was all the intervening points of diversion, and those who might have an interest in protesting the amount of water. Prominently, the two federal and state pumps weighed prominently in over 2 years of discussion about how would this transfer affect their interests. Again, just to refresh, no injury, no unreasonable effects, no unreasonable economic impacts. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is in the loop. They're in support. They like the idea of something that's not regulatory. If it can help solve the problem, it makes everybody's job a little bit easier. Again, this is a lot of information in a small slide, but you can just get the sense if you look at the bottom where it says riparian demand, and then you see that red dotted line. Most years riparian demands are untouched. How to reduce a riparian demand and leave it in the system and have others not take it remains an ongoing question. But you can see the pre-14 demand, and most of the time it's the junior rights, that big block of orange, that are left living the daily uncertainty of, are their rights going to be satisfied? Are they going to be curtailed? The Dos Rios petition had 2 protests. One of the protests came from a pair of agencies that are related to the federal water projects, representing millions of acres of land and millions of acre feet of water. Another protest came from the Central Delta Water Agency and the South Delta Water Agency. Again, issues regarding the transferability of riparian water rights away from the original fee interest in where the parcel, where the water was originally used. Just from another vantage point north of the Delta, going from that upper watershed is Battle Creek, up near Red Bluff and Anderson and Redding. Just a similar type of analysis looking downstream. What would it take to get water acquired from a ranch in the upper basin down to the Delta? These are questions that have not really been answered, and depending on individual projects, one has to be really thoughtful about the stream reach in which their non-use of water is going to be dedicated. In some instances, it's better to have a small, discrete project area than getting too stretched out and trying to move a small amount of water hundreds of miles through a system where it won't realistically ever make it to the end. Speaking of, some of you may recognize the groundwater basins of the Salinas River Valley. Multiple groundwater sustainability agencies working side by side for the whole length of a river. Of course, this year we saw just gorgeous water, for some people too much of a good thing. But again, we know the times when there's plenty. This was that year. But looking a little bit farther upstream, I'm working with the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo County. They acquired a ranch, Santa Rita Ranch. Some of you may recognize Highway 46 on the way to Cambria between Templeton, the Hartzell Dam, Santa Rita Creek. They acquired a large reservoir. That's just a part of it, the surface area wise. In the far corner, you can see some concrete infrastructure. It's a significant 240 acre-foot reservoir. And with the acquisition funded by Wildlife Conservation Board and other land-driven fee acquisition type funding sources, the Wildlife Conservation Board Prop 1 program contributed to the acquisition costs because of the potential to reoperate this reservoir to get more water in a critical stream reach below the reservoir. But again, being really thoughtful about how far down are they trying to make a difference. Here are all the adjacent parcels down to the confluence of Paso Robles Creek. And that is going to be the extent of how far they really are trying to move things downstream. It's just, as you saw with those groundwater basins, there's not enough water to really make the effort to try to get through all of that. Jumping back to the north, we saw the year peak flows, spring recession flows. In the lower right-hand corner, it's dry season base flows that are really of preeminent concern for fisheries management type strategies. If the creek goes dry in a critically dry year, it's game over. But we have years like this where we see all these peak flows, and a lot of the creative thinking on projects that enhance stream flow is how can we capture the peak flows, store them for more than 30 days, and have that water be re-released back into the creek at dry season base flow time. Again, this is more what I'd call blah, blah, blah about water rights stuff. Here we're getting into appropriative water rights. Key distinction between appropriative rights and riparian rights is the riparian right cannot be stored for more than 30 days. If the water comes in the winter and you want to capture that water, you have to have some kind of storage strategy. It can't be done under a riparian right. Up on the South Fork of the Eel River, all these sub watersheds, right in the center, you might be able to focus your eyes on Redwood Creek or Sproul Creek. This is in the area near Garberville. All these watersheds were evaluated on what's their restoration potential. And take a look at the bottom here where the categories say integrity and risk, optimism and potential, habitat condition, and biological importance. So let's just say they all have some biological importance, but there are other considerations. And the one that I found the most refreshing was the optimism and potential. That is really a way of saying, in this case, we're focusing on the Sproul Creek sub-watershed. You can see Marshall Ranch, CE, Wagner Forest, and Sproul Creek, CE. Those three landowners own over 90% of the watershed. That's called optimism and potential. When the Wagner Ranch, just by disclosure, I represented the Wagner family and their neighbor, the Marshall Ranch, in two separate conservation easement transactions with both the North Coast Regional Land Trust and the California Rangeland Trust. Part of these projects created and anticipated there may be projects that enhance stream flow in the future. And in particular, you can see in the corner, Salmonid Restoration Federation and Stillwater Sciences, they evaluated what else can we do on these properties that are now protected under conservation easement, but the easements anticipate and allow future stream flow enhancement projects. Lots of potential. Look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the Marshall Ranch has got a little blue circle. Again, jumping over to the topo map, that circle is about 7 miles from the South Fork Eel River. And site inspection, everybody's long on vision, but that field in the background is, we're breaking ground on a 10 million gallon storage pond with 100% of the impounded flow benefits being returned to stream flow just for the benefit of enhancing conditions during low flow conditions. Technical stuff for those who are interested. Again, don't want to give anybody whiplash, but going down the coast towards San Luis Obispo, similar type project, winter peak flows. And what we're really saying is, if we can store water from December, January, February, March, and April, you can see that big yellow block of water, that will be used to reduce the diversions from the creek at other times of the year, most notably in the June, July, August, September. There will be a reduction because we're now capturing water in times of plenty. I know for a lot of us that makes sense to get these types of projects through multiple levels of constituencies and audiences and landowners. As we know, conservation work takes time and patience. Here, we're getting into categories of water that are not within a water right. My best examples are rainwater and stormwater. Again, going down Highway 46 towards Cambria. At the top there near Cambria, you can see San Simeon and Santa Rosa Creek. Steelhead are the species of concern. Project with a number of landowners evaluating how they can work together to do not the whole lift to help everything for the fish on their backs, but how can multiple landowners coordinate to each do a little bit towards the larger goal. Examples, a berm. We've all heard of sink it, slow it, spread it, sink it. There's obviously the dry season, a little bit of sediment at the bottom there, but water that would otherwise flash off of these hills. Again, stormwater is water that has not yet entered a known and definite channel. There are lots of ways to slow it, spread it, sink it. Again, jumping over to Slow Creek in San Luis Obispo. Here are different tributaries that have been identified as steelhead critical habitat. There's also a groundwater management plan being created. What is of interest is the stream bisects the groundwater basin. And so if someone's trying to enhance stream flow, it's very important to take into account how does that stream flow interact with groundwater, and where does that increment of water get accounted for? Is that a stream flow enhancement that floats on the top? Or what if the creek goes dry and the stream flow enhancement is now recharging groundwater? We look at these problems, kind of like break it into different transfer reaches, each with a different difficulty rating. Here you can see that small rectangle. It's focusing in on a reach near an old facility that the city of San Luis Obispo had, near San Luis Obispo Creek here. They're basically taking an old abandoned water storage shed, and they're taking it out of mothballs for 2 million gallons of storage that will then, again, really, you might say, a really modest yet doable stream flow enhancement reach. It's just getting the Andrew Street Bridge is right at the beginning of the groundwater basin. Getting that water across the basin is complicated. Working with the groundwater planning process is time intensive and takes resources. But here, another project in the same basin, taking 3 different project partners and asking how can they work together to voluntarily enhance stream flow conditions above baseline. Coming into the home stretch, we're almost done. I appreciate everybody sticking with us so far. Here's Santa Barbara, getting over to the Ventura River. The Integrated Water Strategies grant done with Creeklands Conservation, many of you may know them. Likewise, South Coast Habitat Restoration, Watershed Progressive, others. Taking a look at, well, what kind of adjustments can landowners do on their land that fit within a certain suite of project types? Again, good work done by our technical teams. Of course, these projects always have unanticipated somethings that come up. Look at that. We write a grant, and within a couple of years of writing it, devastating Thomas fire affects 4 of our 6, 7 watersheds. Ouch. Going over to western Santa Barbara, Salsapuedes to El Jarro Creek. People might not think of this as like really important steelhead country, but what we're really looking at are these kind of stormwater impoundments that if you were to create some form of what's called like an aquitard or some mechanism, mixing clay, slowing the rate at which this water leaves the system can have measurable effects that have late summer benefits. Coming around the corner through the 101 tunnel, heading towards Montecito, Hot Springs Creek. Again, relatively small creek, so we're not making any, there's no illusion that these creeks are going to save steelhead, but we are in a proving up period of just testing the concepts of some of these legal tools. How can I take water, use less of it, and put it in stream? Here, the U.S. Forest Service acquired an in-holding. They want to take their 50% of a water diversion and leave it in stream. And again, that black line is the groundwater basin. It's a negligible amount of water, but at the same time, it's the principle that these voluntary increments do count in this system. That people are sitting up and saying, well, you're not going to save the river, but we get it. It's not regulatory, and no one's being forced or compelled to participate. It's, I call it proactive, and it's role modeling good behavior. And more nerdy type stuff, if people really want to get into it, always give me a call. I'm happy to talk. Now we're getting down to the last bit of this presentation, which is familiar territory. Here, San Antonio Creek, Ventura, Thatcher, Reeves. Again, I'm not going to give a much in-depth discussion on the Ventura watershed today, other than here we've got a familiar pattern of the OBGMA groundwater basin wells. These wells are alongside creeks and overlying landowner parcels. We know OBGMA is doing its work trying to get a groundwater sustainability plan reviewed and approved by the Department of Water Resources. For those who haven't seen these types of slides before, I just draw your attention to D, that little puddle of blue on the top. When we talked about stormwater or other kind of new water rights, if you were to do that in a certain reach, you may have some interface with gravel, but I think what makes the basin a little bit more complex, again, I know there's a comprehensive adjudication going on in the background, litigation, it's now in mediation. The issue of how much does groundwater and surface water interact with each other in the Ojai Basin, I'm not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole, but there are these clay lenses that confound any analysis in terms of what's the rate at which water at point D, if dropped into the system, where would it go? It'd be like Chinese pinball. But here I think what's really important is to just see that in all these basins, especially along the central and south coast, there's a lot more alluvium and a lot more interconnection between ground and surface water. And for landowners in particular, it represents a lot of uncertainty, leaving aside the issues of the comprehensive adjudication. They're just, one might say, if you're not getting any regulatory scrutiny today, yet in order to receive money from the state, you're going to open yourself up to a whole level of new scrutiny. It's not exactly a great sales pitch. If on balance, if somebody's using, let's say they have 15 or 20 acres, it's a small farm, they might use 45 to 60 acre feet of water per year. Again, 1 acre foot is 325,000 gallons, a 10, 3.2. So you're starting to get up into the range of 10 million gallons of water. What kind of projects would really fit alongside a 10 million gallon existing use of water? Some people are saying, well, you can use my uplands and you can create a stream flow enhancement pond, but don't touch my existing water rights. I need those for my avocados or citrus. And I think, one of the real opportunities as we look towards the Ojai and Ventura is to think about ways that landowners can engage in voluntary conservation to enhance stream flow, working with an entity like the Wildlife Conservation Board, working towards these public trust goals and outcomes. But you have to be smart about it. Both the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Board, they're not everybody's friend. If they have it their way, they might seek to have more in-stream flow, and they're going to think all of you using water need to curtail and use less. One of the, I think, the more promising outputs from the VRIF grant is the recognition that there are a lot of things that can be done to enhance stream flow without having to curtail other people's rights. Let's say the Department of Fish and Wildlife says we need 5,000 acre feet. Are there ways to get to 5,000 extra acre feet in the system without having to reduce 1 acre foot of an existing well pumping or surface diversion? And the answer is yes. Rainwater, stormwater, dozens of small projects, distributed projects. No individual landowner is going to be able to carry the burden of fixing the problems or the challenges. But I think there's a real optimism that more can be done on the voluntary front with water rights. It's a cutting edge, but the Wildlife Conservation Board and others are saying, let's figure out how to make it happen. And I think Ojai and the Upper Ventura are going to be places where we see some real innovation that is landowner friendly at the end of the day. All right, I'm going to take my first breath of the presentation and give everybody just a quick pivot. One of my clients is an organization called Trout Unlimited. I work for their Western Water and Habitat program based in Bozeman, Montana. And we've been working on an IRS, you heard that right, Internal Revenue Service, a tax ruling that would clarify what would happen if somebody donates a water right in exchange for a federal tax deduction. And we had the good fortune of working with a gold mining company on the northern side of Yellowstone National Park. Some of you may know Gardner, Montana, and right up the street from Gardner is the Jardine mine, and the gold mining company was kind of winding down, and they entered a conservation easement transaction with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and then they donated their water rights to Trout Unlimited. They didn't ask for any money. They said, we'll give you all we have at no cost. The value of that independently appraised was close to $1 million. And then Trout Unlimited took those rights and then initiated a separate process. Again, the conservation transaction is different process than the in-stream transfer. But this water went down to the confluence of Bear Creek and the Yellowstone River, and it created a pulse of cold water that was measurable 60 miles downstream. It was measured in billions and billions of 15 cubic feet per second. And that's important cold water refugia for fisheries that often are, you can think of it as like a whirling disease, other diseases that are easier to catch when there's water temperature variations. Water gets warmer, more disease, more death. Colder water is good for these fisheries. So just an image from the Smith River, kind of giving us an example in California of some of our best trout and salmon habitat. Here to, again, I'll put an email. Well, here's my email if people just want to write and say, hey, Tom, here's my address. Send me a copy of the water rights guide. Likewise, if anyone was really interested, there was a lengthy VRIF 1 planning grant legal report that talks about the different project types that both the Ventura RCD, Ventura County RCD, and Watershed Progressive and others work together on. And you can see our legal thinking and some of the strategies on how to enhance stream flow without curtailing anybody's water rights. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. I did see one comment in the chat from Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, and they're saying the situation in our this was earlier in your presentation. They said the situation in our watershed is different due to the few registered diversions. Therefore, we don't need a 1707 water for nature structure for groundwater, question mark.
Well, I'm just going to like make a reference to the comprehensive adjudication. The Ventura County Resource Conservation District is not a party to the litigation, but through that grant, we engaged the different parties and proposed a production forbearance program. Production is defined as pumping of groundwater or diversion of surface water. And the idea would be, especially with some of the, if anyone's familiar with the VRIF planning grant, a lot of effort was put into language around the use of the word framework, conservation credits. One of the main points of gentle advocacy, my role on the grant is to say, if somebody stops pumping water, I'm at 100 units and I can use 80 units, we want them to get credit for those 20 units that they're not pumping. What we have to be cautious about, depending on where in the valley that is being assessed, we can't always make a firm conclusion that the lack of pumping is going to affect a stream flow what might be miles away from the location where the pumping was occurring and the water was being used. But by and large, I think there is a solution out there where, again, not getting distracted by the surface diversions, we are essentially seeing the use of 1707 is applicable to appropriative, riparian, and other water rights. And so there's, without spilling the beans, 1707 could be linked with a non-pumping of a groundwater right if we were able to make the linkage that it would enhance stream flow, even if attenuated. I think legally there's a connection there. Maybe more than you bargained for with that question, but there's the answer.
Any other questions? You can type it in the chat or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'll give you guys a minute.
And I'll be sticking around, so I wouldn't want anybody to feel like they have to think of a stump the water guy question, but I'm always available for anyone who knows me.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Tom. That was great. Very informative. I'm glad I'm recording this so I can watch it later. And with that, you guys, we are going to take, okay, originally our break was going to end at 10:40. We're going to come back here at 10:45 and we will resume. Okay, so see you guys in a second and go enjoy your little rest break. Hey, Scott.
Hey,
You feeling ready?
as I'm ever going to be. So
Okay, I'll give them a minute. Okay, 10:45. And I think we're ready to go on. Put a thumbs up if you are here back from your break. Or just put in the chat. Okay. Okay. People are joining us. So, Scott, you ready to take it away?
sure. All right. It should be showing now, I think.
Yes, I see it.
Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Stakeholder from Ventura County Watershed Protection District. I basically responsible for storm operations and coordinations with the Sheriff's Office Emergency Services for Ventura County, and doing analysis on impacts of the storm events. So let's take a look to see what happened. Obviously, the big storm we had this year was back on January 9th, but overall we had a fairly wet season. So I'll kind of give a summary of what's going on. And let's take a look first at what happened this year compared to the last big year we had, which was 2005. This year, the rain was a heavy orographic event. What that means is the rain happened mainly in the mountains in the areas of the highest terrain, where back in 2005, we had two storms that kind of occurred, one on January 9th and one on January 10th. The January 9th storm went north of Camarillo, kind of through Moore Park, and then up into the near the Piru area. The January 10th storm, which is the one that had the most impacts, came in over the ocean and then kind of slammed into the La Conchita area, then moved right over Sulphur Mountain, then north of Santa Paula, and then north of Fillmore. So some comparisons of some of the storm totals from the January 9th storm, or the period leading up to it, and compared to 2005. As we see from this storm on the left-hand side, the amounts on Nordhoff Ridge, we ended up with over 18 inches of rain in a 36-hour period. Even Matilaha Canyon was over 17.5 inches. But by comparison, out at Port Hueneme only had 1.78 inches in the whole entire period. Even like the coastal plain areas only had about 4 to 5 inches of rain over that period. So the rain was definitely focused to the mountains. And even as far east as the Fillmore area, we still ended up with over 14 inches up in Hopper Mountain. So, but if we take a look at the 2005 event, the rainfall totals weren't as impressive. You can see that definitely where that sail on January 10th went over, like Canal Larga had over 10 inches of rain for basically the same 36-hour period. Ophir was kind of close to what we saw in this storm, but you can see the mountains north of Ojai, Nordhoff Ridge only had about 14.7 inches, and Matilaha Canyon only 12.5 inches. what made it really significant back in 2005 is we had a 14-day period with significantly more rainfall. We had over 43 inches of rain at Nordoff Ridge in the 2 weeks leading up to the storm event, where this year we've only had 29.34 inches. Even by comparison, down at Point Wainimi, there was 11 inches of rain leading up to the storm event, compared to this year's only 2.71. So totally different storm events, rainfall wise. So you can't say a certain way of the rainfall pattern will definitely cause issues. But let's move on and hang on, it went to the end. It's here. It's a start back. There you go. Okay. So let's take a look at the stream flow numbers. The numbers so far from the U.S. Geological Survey for their gauges, they have not come up with concrete numbers. That includes for the Ventura River near Foster Park. The best guess we have right now is about 37,600. Compared to what we saw back in 2005, which was 41,000. Now, the interesting thing about the Foster Park gauge data, if you look at some of the data, there's some published information saying it was the all-time highest water level at Foster Park. That's incorrect. The USGS ran into an issue after 2005 where their gauge was actually beginning to read negative, and they were having issues with their software reading negative values. So they added a 5-foot arbitrary offset so they don't run into those negative issues. But for this year, comparing to what the datum was back in 2005, the water level was definitely higher at the Foster Park Bridge compared to 2005, but it's not the all-time highest. That was back in 1978. So this time it was about 3.5 feet higher this year with lower flows. And we think that's due to not only sediment deposition, but also vegetation that was in the channel. Further upstream, the interesting numbers, we had about 14,700 that came out of Matilaha Canyon, which was a fairly high flow. Compared to 7,000 back in 2005, where in comparison, San Antonio Creek this year we think it's around about 7,000 to 10,000, where back in 2005 it was about 24,000. So you can see how the position of the storms definitely significantly changes where you see the higher flows. And the reason why that, this year we saw it really come out of Matilaha Canyon. We also had similar issues at Santa Paula Creek. We had significant flows, Hopper Creek near Piru, and also Sespe. So, significant flows, but, compared to the same period, Cayugas Creek was just a run-of-the-mill, series of storms. We only saw just under 7,000 CFS there, where we had, more than double that back in 2005. So, where these storms go, and you can also see, we had significant flows on the Santa Clara River too, even though it's outside the Ventura watershed, but we had 124,000, so far preliminary flow at Victoria, compared to like 136,000 that we saw to 2005. So we had some significant flows this year. Taking a look at some of the damage, we saw significant major damage in Norfolk and also in the Matilha Canyon, where we had significant road erosion. We didn't see this significant back in 2005. So because of the focus of the rainfall was in the upper watershed, we definitely saw a higher erosional potential up there and significant impacts to Highway 33, which is still closed and they're still trying to fix it. So a little bit further downstream, this is the Camino Cielo Bridge, got washed out. That's just kind of below Matilha Dam. And then further down, you can see the impact that occurred to the Casitas Robles diversion. They had multiple issues occur there. The main stem of the river is supposed to collapse during high flows to allow the flood flow to go downstream, but their entire intake system got clogged with sediment from the flow coming down, and that's what took them so long to get that fixed and operational so they could actually divert from the information I was able to get. Further downstream, this is San Antonio Creek. The famous sewer pipe break that occurred was mainly due to bank erosion that occurred along San Antonio Creek. So you can see that kind of occur. And then also there was impacts to the ranch down by Highway 33. And you can also see that the flow was significantly high near where Camp Comfort is located. This is off Hermosa Road. That's the lower right image. Water actually got up and some debris got up on Hermosa Road. So that's a fairly significant flow coming down San Antonio Creek. We'll move on. Foster Park just completely got pummeled this year, including the Camp Chaffee area, which is across the river. And we think that that was mainly due to the sediment that was deposited, that was in the riverbed at that time, along with the vegetation, you know, created significantly more damage in this area than what we saw in 2005. Even at Oak Creek, or I should say at Oakview, the levee along the Ventura River, we have sustained some damage to, which has since been fixed. So significant flows down the Ventura River was definitely seen with this event. And that was seen all the way down to the RV park where the water actually went across Highway 101. There was also significant flooding in the downtown area of Ventura, which was not from the Ventura River, but looks like local drainage that just got inundated with the rainfall from the event, and it just had no place to go. If you ever been down to that area, it actually goes up in elevation as you approach the beach, where basically the area around the fairgrounds and also just on the north side of 101 kind of becomes a lake sometimes. And that's what we saw in this storm event. As we move a little bit further east, we lost part of the railroad bridge at Sespe Creek. In fact, the water level height here appears to be slightly higher at this bridge than what we saw in 2005. And then to the right, you can see the images taken at Hopper Creek, where we had a significant breakout impact the Highway 126 and the rural bridge. Unlike what we saw back in 2005, this was more mud this time and sediment debris than it was trees. You know, we saw significant trees coming down, but not like we saw in 2005. There was some huge 8-foot diameter sycamore trees in 2005 that ended up on top of the highway. So we kind of lucked out this one. It was, but after 2005, you know, we had the Piru fire that was north of the watershed that contributed a lot of that. And so we kind of saw that with the Thomas fire. This is really the first big water year since the Thomas fire. And so we saw a lot of that debris left over from the fire actually come down the Ventura River and then Santa Paula Creek. We also had some areas near Santa Paula. You know, Santa Paula Creek had significant bank erosion issues, infected multiple properties, including agriculture. And then we also had some flooding on Highway 126 near Briggs, where we had water actually going across the highway. They actually had to shut it down here, not on top of the east of Fillmore due to multiple issues. And then finally, some photos for the Santa Clara River. The Buenaventura Golf Course got significantly impacted with the flow that basically broke out of the Santa Clara River and went north of the river, across Victoria, just south of Levis Park. There was also issues on the south side of Victoria, but mainly due to high water in the Santa Clara River. That area just could not drain, so it kind of just puddled up against the levee. But significant debris, you can see that came across Victoria. Took them a couple days to actually get that cleaned up and get the road back open. Hang on for a second. I got a couple other stuff. I think I loaded the wrong presentation, so if you can give me just a second here. Yeah, I did. Yeah, sir. I had a couple, sir. Is that? Yeah, hang on for a second. There you go. I do apologize. I had an earlier presentation loaded, so. Oh, let me get back there. All right. The one last thing I wanted to do was this show what the 2023 the water year has been so far. And the interesting thing is we actually recorded 92.65 inches of rain at Marietta Divide. That's an area in the Matilah watershed, basically right along the Ventura Santa Barbara border. It wasn't the wettest number we saw. 2005 was significantly wetter with 97 inches or 97.5 inches. And even 1998, we saw 93, but a significant amount of rainfall so far this year in the watershed. Matilah Canyon, a little bit lower down, only had so far 71.75 inches, which is the 8th wettest. And then we get all the way down to like Casitas Dam. They so far seen this year 46.85 inches. That's basically double of normal. And that's the 7th. And then we get all the way down to the coast where, you know, we're down at Ventura City Hall. It's the 12th wettest year. So, it was a nice wet year, but definitely the rainfall was concentrated in the higher elevations of the mountains, Ventura River Watershed, along with Santa Paula and Sespe Creek is where we really saw the rain so far this year. It has had a nice impact to our reservoirs. I just checked this morning. I think they're now up to over 74% on Casitas Dam. So, before this storm event, it was down at 479 feet, which is just under 30% filled. And so now we're basically looking at the reservoir almost 3/4 filled. So far, that's a rise of 62.5 feet, and that's 104,000 acre feet of storage that we got out of this season so far. And there's still flow coming down the river, and I know Casitas is still trying to divert as much as they can under the regulatory issues that they have to deal with. By comparison, our other water supply reservoir in the county is Santa Felicia, United Waters facility. Before the storms, it was down to 974 3/4 feet roughly. That's 16.5% of capacity. And it actually spilled this year. It spilled in March with the March storms. It actually got up to half a feet over the spillway. And as of even this morning, it's 99.95% full. It's 0.03 feet just below spill, so it's still full. So storage that reservoir basically went up 80 feet over the winter and ended up storing about 68,000 acre feet. Should also be noted that United was able to work with the California Department of Water Resources under some regulatory issues that the state was able to lift this year. They diverted some water out of Piru Creek into Lake Castaic in LA County. And that water will be held and released at a later time for United to use in their diversions later this summer. So there's an additional storage in Castaic that's beyond what they have in Lake Piru. So looking really good for local water storage this year. I know everybody was hoping that we could get Casitas full, but even with the flood event going on, I don't know how much more Casitas really would have gotten if they didn't even sustain the damage, because you really don't want to divert the storm runoff water. It's filled with a lot of sediment, and you're going to lose that extra capacity in your reservoirs when you do take that water in. But it's something that we have to, the water supply agencies have to deal with the environment of the regulatory that's going on, currently with the environmental impacts, fish and everything else. But overall, it wasn't a bad year for water supply. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. If there's any questions or anything.
Yes, there was one comment in the chat. It says, WPD website says flooding of 101 corresponds with 41,000 at Foster Park, ?
Normally that is correct, though, as I stated this year, we saw higher water levels than what we have historically seen. Usually 40,000 CFS was water going over to 101, and so far the preliminary flow looks less than that. But we've had a lot of sediment deposition and a lot of sediment that come downstream since the Thomas fire. We did have a significant flow during the Montecito event that did bring sediment down the Ventura River, and actually did some minor flooding impacts to the RV park in the year and a half after the Thomas fire. But I mean, it's kind of hard to say. We're still trying to evaluate, but our rivers are very dynamic. They're, we have seen 30 feet change in some of the stream profiles of, the Santa Clara River, for example. It's not quite that extreme for the Ventura River, but we can still see significant change in the river, and that how much sediment deposition we have and how much scour we have all has direct impacts on the capacity of the rivers. And I mean, for what the water level height to be 3.5 feet higher with a lower flow at Foster Park is significant. So it's something that we need to try to study and get a better handle on, so we can try to have better flood forecasting in in the future. But, when we do have the model impacts, and even for the flood insurance study, those are static models that don't assume that the river changed. And obviously we do know that the real environment, the river does change. But you can see kind of what happens to the river, even in my last slide here. This is the Freeman diversion. You can see the vegetation in the river before the storm event, during the flood event on January 9th, and what it looks like afterwards. So that's a significant change, even at an area where we have a concrete, weir to stabilize the river, change significantly. So,
does anyone else have any questions? You can type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or just unmute yourself if you're that comfortable.
So Ron, this is Tom Maloney, OVLC. Could it be that with such limited flows during an extended period of drought that we just had bed loading that increased river elevations despite the lower flows?
It's something that we definitely need to take a look at. I mean, I think the fire impact had more impact on anything than the severe drought. One thing I have noticed is that with the extended drought that we've had, river flows have kind of dropped off significantly than what we've seen in some other significantly wet years. So obviously that water is now percolating down into the lower aquifers. But it's something with the change in this extreme wet versus extreme dry. It's definitely going to need to be studied.
Interesting, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Scott. That was very informative. I was very curious to hear like a summary of what happened, so thank you. Okay, so next up, I want to just use the rest of the remaining time to go over a stakeholder survey result that was sent out last month. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and just so you guys know, when I do share my screen, it's a little bit harder for me to monitor the chat or see if anyone's raising their hand or anything. So you can wait until I'm done sharing my screen after the presentation, or you can interrupt me if you have a really pressing question. Okay. So this survey went out, like I said, last month, and it was kind of in conjunction with surveys put out by the Santa Clara River Watershed Committee and by the Watersheds Coalition of Ventura County. So some questions were similar and some were specific to our watershed, and specifically like what things and like what goals we wanted to have in our watershed. And I thought it was a good time, not only because, like I said, like I mentioned, the Santa Clara River was kind of changing like their goals and trying to figure out like their transition plan and stuff like that, but also just good for me to kind of get a sense of what you guys wanted, because when I started at the Ventura County RCD, Andy Spurko was really leading the Watershed Council, and I was helping him. And then I went on maternity leave, and he moved up to Oregon. And so I've been kind of handling it ever since. And I just kind of want to get a sense of what you guys wanted. So our survey results, we had 17 members participate, some from orgs. We did have at least 1 or 2 people just from the community also give input that like to be involved in the Watershed Council. And these top 4 results all had between 16 and 14 votes. So out of 17 people, stakeholders who gave input, that's the vast majority of people. So the benefits that they identified for the watershed was learning about local projects in the watershed, and all the examples you see in the text underneath, like the main benefits, those were specific examples that people gave to me in the survey about what they liked hearing about. So that's why those are included. So they like learning about local projects. So the dam removal project, habitat restoration. They also liked having a space to raise concerns. And one member said that they really liked having a forum as a way to inspire change on the local level and kind of bring awareness of certain issues that were bothering them. And then information sharing on state regulations and programs. So the State Water Board, that was like listed as one of the things that people wanted to stay on top of. And then relationship building. Specifically, I got a few comments from people that really like the benefit and look forward to opportunities to be able to work on common goals and projects together, and that this could be a forum for kind of gathering people's interests and saying who wants to work on certain projects. And then one question I had is what stakeholders are missing. I got a lot of different answers from that. So some people said, you know, more mutual water companies, more local businesses, more agriculture, schools, which I don't know if that's like local schools or like a university or a college. Some people, these are like the patterns I noticed in answers. A few people mentioned groups that would better reflect the community, Native American tribal representation, or organizations led by more people of color. And then 2 people said like we kind of had a good outreach already. One person said, you know, if we had better topics, then that might get more people involved. So that's one thing I'm going to try and like think about for this next fiscal year is topics that might bring in more people, while also, you know, addressing the concerns that all of our regular attendees have. So it's kind of like a balance, but I'm going to try to address that. Survey results of topics people are interested in learning about for the upcoming year. So you can, this is straight from the Google form results slide. The highest ones were water supply, habitat, open space protection, and then the next runner up, which I was interested in, is education and outreach and climate resilience. So that's going to kind of guide me as I think about other people to invite and give presentations. Last year, I was told, someone raised that they really wanted to hear more about beavers in the watershed. And so we did have that presentation last summer. And I do have to say that that presentation on our YouTube channel has gotten over 140 views. So if you have something that's just an interesting topic that you're curious about, there's probably other people curious about it too. And do not hesitate to share those recommendations with me. And then meetings, I had one question on how frequently do people want meetings? And there were some people that wanted more like quarterly meetings, and actually some people that wanted monthly meetings, and the sizable chunk in the middle still wanted to stick to bi-monthly. So I think that's what we're gonna stay with, bi-monthly meetings. And then I was curious about how frequently we wanted to do in-person gatherings. And it was kind of split. Some people wanted every meeting, and I went through the results because a lot of people like put in like their own custom answers. And if I tallied up like how many people said like between 4 and 1 times a year having to meet in person, it was also 50%. So it's kind of a split. So I think for this upcoming year, I'm going to try doing every meeting available, because that was kind of a common thing. People said, I don't necessarily want to go to every meeting in person, but it should be an option. So I'm going to go with that for this upcoming fiscal year, offering a hybrid format for every meeting. And if it seems like, there's only, a couple people trickling in for those, then maybe I will reassess and offer it every quarter. So maybe it's like, people will say, yeah, it's only like a couple times a year, I'm going to really try and go. So we're going to try every meeting hybrid and see how this group takes to it, and if you guys find it worthwhile. And then feedback on in-person that I wanted to share with you guys. So the comments in the orange squares, those were like custom answers that people put in. The first one, the value of council meetings was definitely greater when they were held in person, which if you guys, when I introduced myself at the beginning, when I started, it was still like kind of COVID protocols happening. So that's like a learning curve for me is what was the difference when it was in person and then now. And they go on to say the first 20 to 30 minutes were roundtable updates. I would encourage the council to go back to that format and reserve remote attendance only if needed, with presenters required to be in person. Oh, the convenience of Zoom, but the meeting engagement and group discussion really suffers in that format. So I got a couple of comments similar to that. That was the one I chose to highlight. And then on the flip side, I have some that saying, hybrid meetings are the only option that works with my schedule. One voter referred to watching recordings of the meetings. So there's definitely some benefits to the virtual aspect that I do want to keep in mind, while also wanting to keep that priority, like you guys said, like in like the main benefits was that relationship building. And I do think in-person gatherings does help that, right? So it's this balance of I want to get as many people, even if they're just mildly engaged, that's still good because they can decide when they want to be more engaged and so forth. But while also making sure that we have a good venue for growing those relationships again. Meetings. So I did ask, like, how do people plan to physically attend? And most people, they're not saying I'm never going to go to an in-person. They're saying, most people are saying I do plan to mostly use Zoom, but I feel like there's a need or something really special, I will go in person. And not a bad chunk, about 30% said they prefer to attend in meetings and plan to attend in person when possible. So that's kind of how I'm going to go into it. We're going to see what these 64% of people, it's basically telling me, I'm going to try and create a good motivation for in-person attendance. And we can I'll touch on that later on in these slides about ways to go about that. But I'd also love if you guys have any ideas, please share that with me. Additional goals for the watershed coordinator. This was a question I asked, and I put these in order of how many votes they had. So the top goal that you guys identified was pursuing funding to expand collaborative projects. And then the second runner-up that wasn't too far behind was outreach for the watershed, which I think could be pretty interesting. I didn't really have it on my radar. And as I was thinking about what could be the benefits of the Watershed Council, that kind of came up. So I put that question in there. So it was interesting just to see that how many votes that got. Hosting field trips, that also came up. And then holding workshops. I think the question in the forum was holding workshops on new state regulations and stuff, but it could be other topics as well if we wanted to hold. We could even combine the outreach goal and a workshop, and we could hold a workshop on how to get the word out on maybe certain drought measures or other kind of water pollution. So that's a possibility for us. And then the thing that got the lowest votes was improving the website and the newsletter. So those things will just keep trucking along. And then other feedback we got that I wanted to share with you guys is that the agenda and leadership of the council has been dominated by agency reps and sometimes technocrats, focusing largely on funding projects. The discourse is often tended towards the technical. I'd like to see the council return to a stronger commitment to community education in order to build social and political capacity. I thought that was pretty interesting, and I just wanted to bring it up to the group. That I did see a couple times from other people's questions, this theme of community education also being part of maybe one of the core things that I should be focusing on. And then the second comment The Ventura River Watershed Council has an important role as far as tracking and responding to the concerns of stakeholders and community members. You know, we have an impressive track record of effective collaboration with WCBC, public agencies, and other entities. One suggestion, the VRWC could pursue funding to coordinate an update of the Ventura River Watershed Management Plan. That includes recent research and addresses some of the data gaps. So that's other feedback that I got that I wanted to share with you guys on just what people had noticed about what opportunities there were for the Watershed Council. And then key takeaways that I took away from it, and I'll be happy to hear what you guys think. An increasing desire for face-to-face meetings. And I think I'm going to combine that with the votes for having a field trip, and maybe I'll try to host several field trips a year, and that would kind of motivate more in-person attendees and kind of switch it up a little bit, and you get to go see some projects firsthand. And then compelling presentation topics. Like I said, that beavers in the watershed presentation, it got over 100 views on YouTube. So any kind of topics that you feel might be relevant or curious about, think other people might be curious about, please share those with me. Because the beaver one was not my idea. It wasn't even on my radar, and someone brought it up, and then I went down a whole rabbit hole to find a speaker. So it was pretty interesting. A hybrid friendly format. I did see several people that commented on that they just watch videos, or that they, with the way that their work is and their schedule and stuff, you know, they can't always go in person. And so I do want to offer the hybrid format. To offer a quality hybrid format is sometimes can be a little time intensive, just because it normally requires like 2 staff members, one to make sure that over Zoom looks okay, and one sure to make sure that like the in-person on-site venue is going okay. And I hate the thought of like the experience for either person suffering. So that's still something I'm going to try and tweak. Our last meeting, we did have at a venue, and my projector was just a little too weak for it. So that's why we're just virtual today. I just want to make sure next time I offer it, the projector is robust enough to handle the venue. And then a community focus, that was another pattern I just kind of noticed in people's answers. So I want to work with stakeholders to identify opportunities for outreach, messaging, how to just spread any kind of awareness campaigns that you guys are working on. So those were the big kind of takeaways as I'm going to finalize the work plan and just share this with the leadership committee. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys. I see one hand is raised. I think, Paul, do you have something you want to share?
Yeah, thanks for that, Heidi. That's really interesting. Regarding Matilaha Dam, you know, I see that was something that was popular, and we made a point of using this forum as you know, a primary stakeholder outreach for the dam project. I just want to let you know and others know that there's been sort of a change of leadership at watershed protection on the Matilaha Dam project right now, and right now they're putting their priority and their energy into trying to complete their CEQA and the outreach associated with CEQA and all that. So I'm not sure if we will still be able to do the formal type updates that we were doing. We were doing biannual updates, which was, I think it was really good for the project. It's not my choice right now, but just wanted to let folks know what's going on. The project's still happening, but a lot of energy is going into the CEQA outreach.
Okay, no, thanks for that update. Does anyone else have anything they want to share? You think my takeaways were fair? Lynn, I see you got to go. Thanks for saying bye though. Um,
And thank you. I just want to quickly say thank you for the survey. And it dovetailed nicely with the other two surveys. Probably some of you in the meeting today participated in all three surveys, and you'll see a lot of common themes. So I appreciate the way you presented that today. And just so everybody knows, Laura and Heidi and I meet, today and ongoing to try to make this transition smooth so that we address, the common interest that everybody has for the work that we do. So thank you.
yeah, thank you, Lynn. Any other comments? Do we hate the idea of field trips? Do we think that sounds fun? If you have any workshop ideas, that'd be great. I'm just trying to come up with ways to help motivate us to be together, to kind of learn from each other and yeah, just improve what we can do along the watershed. So no one has any thoughts?
I think field trips are a good idea. And, we historically did a whole bunch of field trips up to Matilaha Dam, and I'm sure if you did that, that would be a popular one. We can work out the logistics. But there's a lot of other projects in the watershed that I think, sometimes it's nice to be able to actually see it in person, hands-on.
Great. Okay. So it sounds like people are pretty receptive to it. So along with trying to start organizing some field trips and testing out like the hybrid format, and I want it to be good next time. So just getting a new projector and stuff like that. I'm going to try and think of ways that I can incorporate more of that kind of community focus that some people were talking about. So yeah, that is me going over the survey results. So if no one has any comments about that, this is also your time for just free comment period if you want to say anything. Otherwise, we'll conclude the meeting. So does anyone have anything they want to say about any of the presentations today or anything of their own projects or concerns? Nope. Okay. Awesome. So thank you guys. The next one, my goal is to have it be a hybrid. I'm still going to work out what venue works best, but be on the lookout for that. And thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.